Okay, so now we're going to go ahead and move into our next session, which will be a panel discussion titled An Insider View, What Funders Are Looking For. And just to introduce myself, my name is Kayla Estes Romero. I'm a graduate student at UIC, and I'm working on this nonprofit capacity building program through the School of Public Health. All right, so we have four lovely panelists, experts who are here with us today. Very excited to get into this discussion. I'll just read these introductions briefly, and then they'll have a chance to introduce themselves as well. So Anna Agarat is the Director of Programs and Partnerships at AMPT. We also have Noelle Gibson with us. She's the Assistant Director of Special Projects at the University of Chicago's Community Programs Accelerator. We also have Julia Talbot with us, who is a Senior Proposal Development Manager at the American Institutes for Research. And finally, we have Cindy Soto, who is the Senior Director of Addressing Critical Needs, Community Impact at the Community Impact Team at the Chicago Community Trust. So we have a wide array of experts with us here today. We will go ahead and get started on the panel. I'll just let you each go and let us know your name, your organization, anything more about your role, and just how your work relates to grant writing. Yeah, I guess we'll start with Anna.
Hello, good morning, everyone. I'm sorry if my voice is a little soft. I am definitely under the weather, trying my best to stay as healthy as possible before the end of this year. My name is Anna Agarat. I'm the Director of Programs and Partnerships at AMPT, Advancing Nonprofits. And here at AMPT, we're committed to strengthening the organizational health and also supporting the long-term development of small nonprofits here in Chicago's South and West Sides. And we prioritize Black and Latina-led community organizations. We also simultaneously work to transform philanthropy by addressing systemic racial inequities and hope to serve as a model for anti-racist systems and processes. And so how it relates to grant writing is that we offer a number of capacity building experiences and workshops and programs, including grant writing, and also providing support and understanding how philanthropy works in general, also providing support for organizations to build up their infrastructure to be able to have long-term sustainability, to be successful in the work that they're doing, and in the communities that they're serving. Thank you so much for the invitation to join today.
Thank you, Anna. Julia, do you want to go next?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Julia Talbot, and there's a painter here, so if there's noise in the background, please bear with me. I am currently a senior proposal development manager at a place called AIR, which is the American Institutes for Research, which is a very large resource-based nonprofit. AIR does work in human service, education, health, and international spaces. A lot of their international work is around equity, but they really are, it's 1,800 researchers providing research, doing research, and providing feedback on social service programming and methodologies. Prior to that, I worked for the city of Chicago in the Department of Family and Support Services, where I ran the RFPs for social service programming for them. I've also been on a number of boards of various sizes, and my children's RFPs. So I have experience on both sides of the table in terms of being somebody who put out RFPs and read a lot of applications, but now I'm working for a large nonprofit that does hundreds, if not thousands, of applications and bids every year. But and I'm delighted to be here.
Thanks, Julia. We're very happy to have you. And Cindy, do you want to go next?
Happy to. Hello, everyone. My name is Cindy Soto. My pronouns are she, her, ella, and I'm the Senior Director of Addressing Critical Needs at the Chicago Community Trust. It's one of 5 strategies at the Trust. We also work on catalyzing neighborhood investments. We work on building household wealth, on collective power, which is organizing community leaders, and we also do advocacy and policy. We're a public trust, which means we have a little bit more flexibility in terms of being able to lobby elected officials as well. And we have a pretty far reach in the region. We particularly focus in Chicago, but we also support various organizations across the county and also some neighboring counties. We're happy to partner with AMP. They're one of our organizations that are really looking at how we can increase support for communities that have been harmed by systemic racism. Our focus is to close the racial ethnic wealth gap, and we've been doing this in many different ways. In my portfolio in particular, we look at basic human services. So we cover anything from homelessness to food insecurity to early childhood education. So happy to be here, answer your questions. Feel free to ask me anything that comes to mind. Like Julia, I also spent some time at the city and actually other government entities. So I might be able to provide some insight as well in terms of RFPs to become a delegate agency for government, if I can. So thank you so much, and I'll pass it back to you, Kayla.
Yeah, and we do also have Noelle here. She's off camera right now, but if you want to introduce yourself, Noelle, go ahead.
Yes. Hi, Kayla. Thank you so much. Apologies for being off camera, everyone. I am getting settled, triple booked this morning. But my name is Noelle Gibson. I manage a nonprofit accelerator, the Community Programs Accelerator at the University of Chicago through the Office of Civic Engagement. At the CPA, we work with organizations on the Chicago South Side closest to the university. We help organizations try to increase their capacity. And we manage 3 programs from foundational capacity building projects to midway at our associates and our core programming, which we do at that point administer a $50,000 grant. And we work with those organizations for 2 to 3 years. Projects look like anywhere from executive coaching to resource development, staff development, program data and evaluation, as well, etc. We try to really meet organizations where they are at so that we can help them be sustainable, viable organizations, and as well as continuing to support alumni organizations, as well as being a network or a dot connector for these organizations and other university programming. So really happy to be here, share more about our work and what we look for when we are looking for those organizations that we give funding to, as well as the type of resources we provide for organizations as they look to build out their development infrastructure.
Thank you so much. So yeah, we have a wide array of experience from people who grant funds to you all have had experience applying for funds and different experience of providing like wraparound support for organizations other than, you know, just funding. So just for our participants, I do have some questions here, but you know, we want to make this the most useful experience for you. So please put your questions in the chat as we go through. Yeah, wealth of knowledge. So, but just from your all's experience, what aspects of a grant proposal would you say stand out the most to funders? Yeah, I'll let whoever wants to go.
I'm happy to start us off. So as I mentioned, the mission of the trust is to close the racial ethnic wealth gap, and we particularly look at brown and Black communities that have been harmed by issues like redlining and other systemic issues that have really targeted communities and populations and stripped them of their wealth. So any grant proposals that really dive deep into changing these kinds of systemic harms, that really understand community needs, and that work with community members, people with lived expertise, to design efforts that improve individuals' overall well-being, but also the communities, would be really great. Being as explicit as possible in terms of your understanding of cultural diversity, race diversity, really any kind of detail that you can provide that really identifies that you are looking at the work through a human-centered approach would really be an advantage for us. And this includes people with disabilities, LGBTQ community, other populations as well that have been marginalized or continue to feel the oppression of a lot of the systemic issues that we try to overturn. So that would be important, that would stand out. We do particularly require that all of our grant partners, and this is a recent change at the Trust, provide demographics of who is on their board, who is on the team, and if their leadership is BIPOC-led, Black, Indigenous, people of color. So a lot of emphasis towards racial justice is key for the Chicago Community Trust.
Hi, we are still on what are funders looking for in organizations?
What is it about a grant proposal that would stand out?
I think in our experience, or what I look for, and in speaking with different funders throughout this past year, our next wave of what we're looking for is collaboration and impact. In the application, sure, you're raising funds for programming and activities, but speaking more on that impact, and not just about the amount of people you're serving, but what does your programming actually mean for the community you serve? And overlapping collaboration, is there an opportunity to do what you're doing with other organizations? Kayla, speaking to your comment about wraparound services, how can we do more? How are you showing that your impact and your collaboration to truly talk about community?
Sort of following up on what Cindy and Noelle were saying, I have a much broader perspective in terms of clearly the most important part of any application is the narrative section. That's always going to be the highest weighted. And I think that the most challenging thing that I've noticed over the years is being able to interpret the questions that the funder is asking in the application, or the bullet points that you're supposed to respond to correctly. I can't tell you how many times people just and then crafting a succinct but like appropriately granular or detailed answer. And that's really tricky. Like, it's really hard to figure out, especially sometimes there's page limits or character limits or whatever. It's very tricky to kind of to craft those answers. And it kind of comes to I think things that maybe we'll be talking about later about how, how do you prepare yourself to submit a proposal or a bid? But I can't tell you how many times I've read applications where the person simply didn't read the question very carefully or sit with it, and then provided an answer that was just 1 degree to the left or right of what you really wanted to or needed to know to give them the highest score possible. So I think, just to sort of circle back on that question, what would stand out to me the most is really sitting with the question and answering it, or asking for clarification from the funder if you have questions about how to interpret the question correctly. A good answer is a joy to read.
Anna, did you have a response, or else we have a question, but I'll give you a chance to respond as well.
I saw the question in the chat, but I really want to echo what Julia said. I think the first thing that comes up for me definitely is understanding the question and responding to that question, like answering the question that is asked. And I think this is where, depending on how the grant application came to be, if you do have a relationship with the program officer, understanding like what their role will be in being able to really I guess emphasize the impact that you are making, so that you can really provide information in your grant narrative, in your proposal narrative, that will then give them the resources to be able to accurately advocate on your behalf, when it comes to that part of the application process. I think knowing what they are looking for, and that really comes with time and relationship building to be able to give the answers that will appropriately prepare them. Yeah.
Looking at to answer that question in the chat about the type of question and answer is being misinterpreted, I can think of two examples that I would see quite frequently. One is that we slightly changed an application question so that the answer shifted a little bit because we wanted to get more clarity, or we were trying to improve the application question, and that the applicant didn't very carefully read what we were actually asking for and provided the stock answer that they had crafted from the last year. I have no problem with people reusing language, because often language that is being reused is often, like better crafted, it's more articulate, it's just been gone over a little bit more than maybe something that you wrote yesterday, right? So I have no problems with that, but what I saw is that people they kind of read 2/3 of the question, thought, oh, I got this and I have the answer, and then they just threw in their thing and their answer, and what we were asking for was slightly different, and so then they didn't, the answer didn't happen. And so that's one of the things that, provide an example of a question and answer that was misinterpreted. And the second example was that we asked a very complex question that could have been interpreted maybe a different way. Writing a good application question is harder than you think, because you really do have to think about how if you have 100 people who are potentially going to read that question and answer, chances are like 100 people might not see it all the same way. That's like kind of the beauty of 100 people. But so a lot of times, like, you think that we would think that we were asking a question that was fairly straightforward, but somebody coming with a different lens was interpreting it way differently. I'm thinking, like, I don't have anything offhand, but I'm like looking at a proposal that I'm working on now that's pretty dense, and a lot of the questions that we ask are dense, complex questions, and that there's just a lot of, there is area for misinterpretation. To that end, I would always, if there is any kind of a pre-submittal or way, there's usually, even with your government grants where you're not encouraged to speak directly to the funder during the bid period, there's ways of communicating and getting clarification. And I would always encourage people to go to those pre-bids or look at those PowerPoints and get the opportunity so that you have better clarity on what in fact the funder is looking for. And also in those spaces, you can often ask your questions and get an immediate answer, as opposed to, sort of throwing something onto what seems like a random, question email, to a random nameless, faceless person.
I want to chime in here. I think, Julia, you share what you shared highlights a few things for me. So part of my work at the CPA, what we do, we host grant writing workshops, as well as we host more intentional capacity building projects with individual organizations, helping them to build out their grant writing infrastructure. And in those workshops, we discuss just what Julia just shared of, sometimes the questions are complex and dense, and how do we break down those questions and create resources so that when you are going back to applying for grants, that you have you have resources that where you can go back to copy and paste, adjust per each grant, but that it helps you to break down the questions. You're able to visually see what your options are as far as a response and what goes, tailoring your response to the specific questions of that specific grant. And I think this also highlights that one, questions can be misinterpreted or interpreted differently, but also recognizing biases within questions. And then so both on a double approach, working with organizations to break down questions within a grant, but also working with grant funders to review their grant questions and making sure that they are understandable to masses, or if we're trying to diversify who we are funding, that those organizations and those people are properly understanding the questions so that they can be a good potential recipient.
I love that. So you guys touched on how people who are looking for funding can approach funders and how important the building a relationship is. So, usually the most accessible way to connect with funders is if they have a proposal, if they have an RFP out. You mentioned, Julia, they'll sometimes have, a public presentation about the RFP where people can ask questions. So I guess outside of that process, could you guys touch on the importance of building relationships with funders, and like, what are the ways that nonprofits can do that outside of maybe that presentation?
I'd love to chime in here. So the CPA also operates as our own nonprofit, and so we raise funds for one of my major initiatives, a Southside Strong conference. So a major conference held on campus and raising funds for that. One way we connected with funders and built relationships, inviting them to our events. First, we invited them to workshops that we held monthly to show them what our impact was already and how we can scale it to be something greater, like a conference. And then at that conference, not only do we have workshops, but networking lunch and resource tables. And we're just able to really show and highlight at a high level what our work is and what scaling looks like. And so not only when you're applying for grants and you're interviewing, that's one thing, but building that relationship, helping the grant managers come to you and see the actual work and meet your constituents, I think that helps and goes a long way when looking to continue a relationship, where we talk about annual funding versus one-offs.
Yeah, Bill, you go.
Quickly, I'll add to what Noelle mentioned in terms of making connections and really building a network. The Chicago Community Trust has quite a number of different partnerships and affinity groups. And so you can make a connection with any one of us. You can reach out to our affinity groups. You can become a member of an affinity group. If you would like to be a member, you can join many events that they host, that we host. I'm all about keeping it real. Don't try to impress us to a degree where you kind of feel like you're overcompensating. Just be yourselves. If your work is really having the impact that you think the grantee or grantor is looking for, let that work speak for itself. Additionally, I would say to the events and networking, maybe just ask to meet for coffee, and don't just expect to also meet with the highest person of, the person in leadership, or, talk to everyone. I mean, there's impact coordinators at the trust who care just as much about the work, who also review RFPs, they provide feedback. They're program managers, senior directors, but sometimes our schedules can be a little tight. All of us are significant. None of us, hold one advantage over the other when it comes to grant making. We really are a team. So don't be afraid to reach out to anyone at the trust, no matter where they stand, what their title is, but also reach out to some of our other partners and attend the events. And again, let the work speak for itself. I love it when people want to demonstrate all of their good work. But sometimes I feel like, we are making it harder on you all. Know that we are people too, and we understand, that there are challenges and there are growing pains. And if that's the work that you want to demonstrate in terms of what needs support, what needs attention, show that, showcase that. And that authenticity really stands out.
But I would like to just add to what Cindy and Noel were saying in terms of, remember that every funder is looking for people to give money to, essentially. Like, they're competitive process, but we want as many people applying for our money as possible. We want people, we want to see new applicants. And so, and this sort of speaks to a larger thing, kind of underlying what Cindy was saying in terms of like, good work is inherently attractive. And so if your organization is really knocking it out of the park, make sure that you connect with the potential funders through all of the things that they're offering to look for you. But then also don't be shy about reaching out to Block Club or Axios or some of those services. Funders read newspapers and news services, and sort of think about a little bit about this in terms of like just an overall marketing plan for your organization, or how you're getting the word out about all the work that you're doing. Is the first thing that I guess that I would sort of say. The other thing I wanted to just mention is that depending on your level of engage, how big your organization is and your budget and something, at some point you need to have people on your board who have connections and that are going to help you get your organization in front of the right people or the right funders. Like, not everybody on your board is going to be able to do that. And in a lot of cases, depending on the size of your organization, it's hard to kind of transfer from that kind of friends and neighbors and relatives type of board to something that's a little bit more strategic. But ultimately, a smaller organization really does need to have a few people with some kind of connections, and they don't have to be like the standard connections to a bank or to a law firm or whatever, like, or to whatever, but just somebody who is on your board who's willing to think about funding and how to get your organization kind of to the next fiscal step there. I don't know if anybody else on the panel has thoughts about the roles of boards in fundraising, though.
Yeah, I do. I think oftentimes, or at a certain point, when organizations are starting out, your board is composed of people people who want to see you succeed and do well. And then the first transition is when you have found board members who are invested in your cause, your mission and vision. And development, raising money, everyone says they hate it. But guess what? Everyone can do it. And it's on someone, the board or leadership, to provide tools and resources that make others more comfortable doing it. But be clear, it is a responsibility of everyone. Everyone on the board has a fiduciary responsibility to the board and the organization. And the sooner we address that and be clear about the accountability of the board, I think the more successful boards and organizations will be in their fundraising effort. It's uncomfortable, but it is possible. But I do believe every member has a fiduciary responsibility to the board or organization.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say diversify your board. You might lean on the people that you work the closest with or who are in your network. But if you are missing a couple of key talented people, let's say grant writers, or you need an attorney, or maybe put out a kind of a job post through Idealist or Volunteer Match, and say that you're looking for board members, and really lead with your cause and your mission, and people will be attracted to that. There are many people that are looking to either increase their own experience, really be able to lend more of their time if they have availability that maybe previously they didn't have. So there are other people out there that are really willing to ensure that your mission is carried out. So feel free to go out there and look for them if you don't already know them.
And the other thing is I was on a board where we all had to do a direct ask, and I didn't really want to do a direct ask. That felt uncomfortable or unpleasant to me. But one of the people on the committee or on the board that I was, that I had to do this on, basically gave me a script and was like, here is a list of 10 people to call. This is what you say. The first time they say no, say this. The second time they say no, pivot to that. And it was broken down in a way that was impossible for me not to do it. Like I looked at it, I was like, well, I can read and I can read a script. So I guess I'm going to be doing this. And I'm calling people that kind of know about the organization. Like not everybody is going to come to your board. Like people come to boards and you want people on boards because they have a lot of different skills, and you might have somebody who's great at events, but like not everybody can write a grant, or not everybody wants to do research about where to find funding. And so it's, but everybody can pretty much read from a script if you can come it up. And I think from an equity standpoint, that's also really important because, and I am obviously not the person that can speak about this with a high level of legitimacy. But in my experience, when I'm looking for board members, especially board members from underrepresented Black, Brown, LGBTQIA, people that there's a lot of, it's sometimes hard to find a grant writer who isn't already being asked to be on 17 other boards because they're a grant writer of color. And so you're going to have to grow your own and be a little creative, because it is I think equity and inclusion on these things is very important. But I'm going to shut up as a white person on this board and let somebody else kind of take that one up.
Well, Julia, just to echo what all of you've been saying, I think board development is really key. And one of the things that we do at AMPed, we do have a cohort that's centered around board development. And we talk a lot about the importance of being very clear about the roles and responsibilities of board members. And so to your point, Julia, about knowing that you had this script available, like what are the ways that you're onboarding your board members? How are you setting up your board members with specific skills and tools so that they really can be the appropriate advocates for your organization? Because at the end of the day, they're supposed to be the champions, right, for your organization. And if they are not set up in the way that they can really do that for you, it becomes the point where your board members now become really, really difficult to work with because they don't know what they're supposed to be doing, right? And I think it's really, really important to be very clear about roles and responsibilities to ensure that they have the onboarding, the skills, the trainings, the tools they need to support you and support your organization in the best possible way, and to be able to advocate not only with their time and their energy, but then eventually also bring money to the organization as well.
Thank you so much for that. Something that we talked about reminding me actually of the networking event that we had last week on with AMPed. So the organization we were working that was presenting was Mobile Makers Chicago, and she was talking about how she kind of started with her branding. And so I think when you were talking about like diversifying your board members and the expertise that you have, like that's one avenue that I kind of don't really consider with nonprofits as much as marketing and branding. But like I'll say her presentation looked very good and her social media looked very good. Like those things I think, would show that you're serious about the work that you're doing. So people who are getting started in those careers of branding and marketing, like are working to build portfolios. So if you can ever find somebody who is, starting in that career, that might be another good avenue for getting volunteer work on a board. But just one thing that sparked my mind. Again, just want to encourage people to put their questions in the chat. But another question I have for you guys is what are funders looking for in a budget as part of a grant proposal? What are maybe the common errors that you see, or just overall, what are you looking for?
Maybe a couple things. just a fair balance of staff compensation versus operation costs, or maybe high program costs and maybe you're not paying yourself enough. So just a balance of uh, what's a good word, of drastic variances between line items, and where everything's important and you do have to prioritize some, but making sure that there's no great variance in between, or that we often see of salaries, programming versus operations and accounting, things like that.
I think Noel covered it. I would just add that if there's some discrepancies in your budget, that you provide a very clear explanation as to why that might be there, whether you're waiting to get payments from the city. Let's say if you're, waiting on vouchers to be submitted on your end and you're waiting on payments, which we know sometimes, it can take some time from the public sector. Just make that notation so that we're not left wondering why there's a big gap in your budget, and also ensuring that, as Noah mentioned, compensation, people's time isn't impacted by any kind of delays in your funding.
When I was working for the city, the things that I looked at when I was looking for budgets were a couple of different things. Like Noelle, I always looked at staff salaries and how those were allocated, because if I saw somebody, that personnel budget was very important to me. I looked for just like, what was the spread in terms of, okay, your ED is on there for 2%, but like when I do the math, they're making X number of dollars a year. But then the person who's really running the program, there's a huge salary discrepancy that would be a red mark for me, because then I'm like, that person's not going to stay. Then and staff churning, while kind of inherent to this landscape, unfortunately, means I can, as a funder, I'm going to assume that my programmatic quality is going to be less stable or less predictable, or it's going to be negatively impacted. Because if you're hiring new people all the time, you have to onboard them, you have to get them up to speed, and they're just not, that means that your program has a gap where it's not high, where it's sort of diminished in terms of its productivity. The other thing I would look for was, we always had an other column, and a lot of the funding that we provided, we knew that we weren't providing really enough money to do the entire scope at a high level. And so it was really when the funder took the time to put in the stuff that they were going to be supplementing, the money that they were going to be supplementing into that other column, that was also super helpful. I also unfortunately would have people submit budgets where they put put it into the wrong column. So they would put their ask into that other column, and that was problematic, because then it looked like they were giving us a program for free, and we'd have to go back and be like, hey, it was, please just read the instructions on that. The other thing that I would look for was that there were always a few budget questions or programmatic questions. And I would look to see how those aligned between what you were saying you were doing in your program and how it related to how the personnel aspect of your budget. So if you had a program, you had a narrative that was like, my program manager is going to be like turning the world backwards and, flying to the moon. And then they were only on there for 45%. Like, I wanted to just see kind of like, I was looking for consistencies, internal consistency, more than anything else. Like, to be honest with you, the money part really didn't matter, because we kind of figured everybody made up numbers, but the ratios really mattered a lot.
I think one of the things we talk a lot about during our workshops at AMPT is how the budget will reflect the values of your organization, because the budget really does tell the story of your organization. And I think that many of us come into creating budgets with a lot of our own personal approaches to money and finances, whether that be our backgrounds and how we were raised with money. And so being able to, at the beginning, be very open about that during our workshops, and then build the tools and the skills to build a budget, to really help people understand how the budget of your organization and what you present in a proposal really should reflect the values of your organization. And it tells the story of how you're spending money and doing the work of the organization. And I think not enough people, not enough of nonprofit leaders really think of the budget in that way, and therefore miss out in many opportunities to really be able to reflect how good the work that they're doing is through the budget. And so I think very similarly to what Noelle was saying about staff compensation, really being able to think through, okay, you're spending all of this money on your programs, but are you paying yourself? Are you really making the time to think through, how am I going to be sustained year after year doing this work? Additionally, it's really important to think about cash flow. And that is one of the conversations we have often. And so I think to Sandy's point about being able to show those discrepancies, if you know that you're waiting on something that's coming, how are you accounting for that gap in cash flow? How are you, I think, foretelling for anyone who is reading this budget that you have thought ahead, that you are making plans and thinking these things through? Because if you're not showing that, then it shows that maybe you're not really here for the long run. You're not really doing the work to ensure that these programs can run year after year and time after time.
Thank you so much for those responses. So when thinking about preparing to respond to a request for proposals, how much time should an organization dedicate to putting together a grant proposal? So what are kind of the first steps of that process?
I think the first time you fill out a grant application, it should take you substantially longer than the fifth time you fill out a grant application. And how long it takes you to do that first or your second application depends on how much materials and resources you have, or where you are at in your journey. Are you just getting started, or have you established your mission vision? Do you have programs you could reflect on? Do you have the data of those programs to answer those questions that Julia mentioned accurately and truthfully? And sometimes I work with organizations in-house and as a consultant where we have to establish those documents and resources. We have to create that folder of where you know where to go exactly for every time you are completing a grant application. So the first time, I think, greatly depends. But if you do it right, or if you create a system and a process, as you apply for more grants down the line, it should not take you substantial.
I do think it's subjective. It really depends on who's on your team, you know, what else you have going on at the organization. It depends on whether you are familiar with the issue or if you've applied for the grant in the past. You know, if you have applied for a grant in the past, you know, I would say if you didn't get it, I would get feedback and then ensure that you're using that feedback to apply for the grant again if that opportunity arises, and hopefully that shortens the time that you spend on applying for a grant. One advantage in trying to start early is that a lot of grant opportunities, and this is common in the public sector, is that there are opportunities to go to info sessions or hearings so that you can get more feedback as to what is being sought after in terms of who the grant partners would be for that grant opportunity. So, you know, if you start early, you might get in on some of those info sessions, but certainly it depends on your capacity. It depends on your intel in terms of the issue area. So make sure you take stock of what you can invest in. If you would like to seek out those dollars, smaller grants, probably a bit more competitive. You know, you might say, I don't have the time to do this right now. I'm going to try to focus on the larger grants that might have less applicants, also competitive, or, you know, all of it can vary, but certainly, you know, that would be, I think, something that you'd have to decide internally how you would approach it.
So in my current position, you know, my organization does, you know, I think, you know, when I checked, so it was like slightly over 1,000 bids or applications a year. And one of the things they have to do, because it's a big shop, is to cost out, you know, how many hours they are going to put into the doing the application. And so I was just pulling a few of these up. And I can see, like, you know, your larger applications for your more complex proposals are longer. So I'm seeing here there's for, let's see, what's this for? An apprenticeship program. You know, this is all research stuff, but somebody has budgeted 36 hours to write and that's just the writing. That's not like gathering all of the stuff. You know, that's not the budget, that's not gathering all the pieces of paper that an applicant might want in terms of, like, you know, your 501c3 and your proof of insurance and all of those kinds of things. Those things are not just the writing. I'm seeing one that's 36 hours. I'm seeing one that's spread across 4 people that is 34 hours. I'm seeing a small one that was a subcontract that's coming in at 19 hours. So I think, like, for your really, you know, some of the really big proposals, I imagine that would be more because they're complex, you know, they're $15 million bid tends to require, you know, not $15 million worth of work on the front end, but more time. So it looks like, if you just from a very basic standpoint, like, you probably should budget, you know, 30 hours, or I'm looking here at a really big one that's like $15 million. And it's, let's see, 80, 90, 100, 120, 150, 190, 100, 200, and yeah, so that like this really big one, it's being bid out for, you know, it's like it's being budgeted for 210 or 215 hours to pull it together across. That one was like 10 people. So realistically, and now I'll say this, is like, I work for a very well-resourced, huge organization where people have time to do this, but just in terms of, like, looking at how much time they're budgeting, that's how much time they're budgeting.
Do you have anything, Anna, on first steps that organizations?
It's so subjective, I would say, in terms of how much. I mean, there are some grant applications. For example, AMPT does a very, very small grant every year, and we anticipate that our grant application will hopefully only take 30 minutes to an hour to submit, right? Versus, as Julia was mentioning, like, you know, if you're going to be budgeting for 36 hours, then part of me is like, can you also put that in the budget that you've spent 36 hours applying for this grant? So it really is incredibly subjective.
Yeah. No, I think though that one thing that it brings up in terms of what you're saying about, like, can you budget? Like, most small organizations can't really afford that kind of time. And so it really comes to pushing out, and I think maybe this can come up maybe in your next panel, is talking about equity and inclusion. Like, equity seems like it's a pretty hot topic. And a lot of funders, I know the city of Chicago is incredibly interested in equity and inclusion, and how do you level a playing field so that you get different kinds of applicants in, or people who are being pruned out during an application process that inherently sort of favors bigger, better resourced organizations, but who often don't bring stuff to the, you know, bring as wide a lens or as wide a breadth of experience to the table, and how do, you know, as what recourse or what avenues do funders, you know, potential applicant or your applicant pool have to kind of push on that or engage in that discussion outside of the fund, outside of like grant applications?
Yeah, that's very real. And I feel like our question in the chat kind of relates to that a little bit. But talking about going back to budgets and discrepancies we may see there. So it says, if an organization is realizing that they need to hire or add more hours to a staff member in order to support the expansion of their program, but cannot do so without more grant funding to compensate, how can they reflect this in their budget in a positive light? Is it through the request part, or do they hold off on increasing hours and just struggle to keep up with their programs? What do you guys think?
I think this is a great area where you do lean on your board if you already have that established, as well as this is where you hone skills. This is where leadership takes on, or it's very complicated, and I don't want to say or working without being compensated at any level, but at that point, it is on leadership and the board to fill in those gaps of the organization and calling on more monthly donors somehow, because you have to have money to operate. And so while I hear you and can empathize with that real fact, it's how else do we fill in the gaps within the organization if we are truly committed to our mission and our programming.
And I would say it depends on the kind of grant. If you're looking for general, probably note some of your staff shortages. If you're looking for project-based grants, then we really do need you to have a strong staff to be able to lead those projects. So really kind of consider, is this the right grant for the capacity that I am currently working with? Certainly, if the capacity is not there to ensure that the program or project can take off, and it's not a grant to be applied for staffing, matters, then it might hinder you from getting that grant. But if it's one where capacity building is one of them, and general operating grants tend to be a little bit more flexible in that regard, then certainly make that known to say, we want to really scale this and we need more staff members, including strengthening this with more dollars. So it just really depends. If you want to be forthcoming about it, no matter the issue, like I said, keeping it real is helpful. But you don't want to also that you just are not capable of staying afloat, because then that's another type of grant. So it just really depends on the grant that you're applying for, and ensure that the grant that you are applying for, if it relates to staffing issues, can really be applied, those dollars, to capacity building.
I think also if this is a grant where, for example, you already have a relationship and you may be applying for year 2 of a grant, this is an opportunity to ask for an increase in the grant, for example, especially if it's a general operating, because you can make the case that you are asking for an increase to supplement this growth that you're experiencing based on how much demand from your programs. However, if this is a grant that you're writing because you're trying to expand your programs to fit the grant that is being requested, I would caution you against that. One of the things we talk about all the time is please don't go after grants that you're going to create a program for just to get that money. Like, that is a slippery slope of spiral towards not unsustainability for your organization, constantly going after grants that you have to create a program for or expand a program to fit that grant.
I very much agree with what Anna just said. The other thing I would go is I would go right back to like what I was saying a couple of questions ago about your board. You should have, your board should be involved in some kind of a 2 through 5 year kind of strategic plan about where you want to grow and how you want to grow. And that's going to help you make good decisions about what kinds of things you're going to engage in. And also your board, that's like between 5 to 15 people that theoretically can put their heads together and help you to solve this kind of a growing pain. Because this is what you're talking about is like, this is a growing pain. This is your organization is growing, and your board is kind of the people that you're supposed to be depending on to guide you on how you're going to do that growth and to help you, like something like this. When I would read this question, it's like my 30-second response is basically like, take the administrative burdens that you can offshoot onto the board or hire a consultant for off of your programmatic staff's plate so they have bigger bandwidth. But ultimately every organization is different, and every organization is going to come to the solution that fits them and their organization. I'm not going to pretend that I know the right answer.
Great, thank you. So another question, what tips do you have for writing compelling grant materials? So thinking about the writing process and writing skills. Yeah, what are your tips on writing grants?
I think here's a good time to talk about technology and how AI and ChatGPT is big now. And a couple of things. I think more organizations should implement technology. I think it helps with operations and programs. But in regards to funding and grant applications, I want to talk about using available resources, but also if you are using those resources to make sure that it's true and accurate and you can still speak to whatever a prompt or response the technology or AI generates. And so we talk about one of the reasons we hire grant writers is to create that compelling narrative. And I think, but first getting out your why, listing out your narrative, not your narrative, your impact. So your programming, the numbers attended, the numbers impacted, and sharing some of those stories of the people who participate in your program or your staff responses, using those feedback and that data to craft that compelling narrative and story. For an example, I work at the CPA. We work with 9 neighborhoods on the south side of Chicago. However, the impact of our work expands greater beyond the 9 neighborhoods, because the organizations we work with still have a greater impact. And the work we do with 100 Black men is not just for the south side of Chicago, it impacts the greater Chicago area. So that's still high level, and then I can break it down, but that speaks to our impact and shows some numbers along with it. Work in 9 neighborhoods, but our impact reaches 30 neighborhoods. And I can accurately, because we track the neighborhoods we work in, zip codes, as well as our program locations.
Yeah, that's great, Noelle. And if I can add, I would say that what makes a narrative compelling is also understanding what matters to the funder. And so, for example, if I am writing something to Sandy at the Chicago Community Trust, and I know that what is important to them is closing that economic racial gap, then I'm going to show the very clear through line of how my programs will then support the solution that they are looking for. And so I would say with any kind of compelling narrative, definitely like use the technology at your disposal, make sure that you are using the feedback and those quotes, implementing that real human story and being centered in that, and being very clear about how your program is really impacting the solution that this funder or the city or whoever you're applying to is looking on working at.
think to build on what Anna and Noelle both said, first of all, if you're going to use ChatGPT, that's a great way to get a first draft, but you need to watch your prompts and understand that it's not going to give you a final. You'll need to edit that draft. I've read enough ChatGPT inspired answers that were not well edited, and I'm just like, this got you to 60%, but you needed to take out all the weird stuff. You know how when people do ChatGPT with visual images and the hands are always funky and weird, it's like that with the writing. So you're gonna have to go through and prune out the extra thumb or the whatever that's going on in there before you hit submit. The other thing, and this kind of goes back to what we were saying before, is that good work is inherently attractive, and you should always write a proposal that accurately reflects what your organization is capable of accomplishing with the time and the money allocated for the program model. Set yourself up for success in that grant proposal. We can kind of tell if you're a $30,000 organization applying for a $50,000 grant and you only have 2 people on staff. We can tell that you're biting off more than you can chew, and understand that every funder answers to somebody. Every funder has to sell their decision and their confidence in you to somebody else at some point. And even if you have a person that's opening their checkbook and I'm going to write you a check to do whatever, they're going to answer to their conscience at some point about if they got their money's worth, or if they understand, if what they did was truly the right decision. And so make sure that your grant proposal kind of sets them up to give those answers to their funding stream, their funder about, or whoever's checking their work about well, why did you think this was a good idea, and how is this going to play out? So I think right sizing the proposal and right sizing the ask is always super important. And then one thing I have learned from my current job, and again, very well resourced organization where people can spend billions of hours prepping, is that I've noticed proposal teams or the researchers start their applications way beforehand. So foundations have pretty standard times where they put proposal, they open up their application process. And a lot of times, some of those questions just aren't going to change. So I would say, use the anticipation of funding that you are and that's a legitimate question to call and ask a funder, hey, are you going to stick to the same schedule, or do you see any big programmatic changes coming down? That's a completely legit thing. And use that information if you're really, if you want to continue funding, or if you want to you're going after new funding, to work into a strategic plan, or use that opportunity of that anticipated funding to really start before the application opens, to think about what you want to do and say, and get some of the more rote aspects of the application down. And that means that when DFSS puts something on the street for 60 days, you can spend that 60 days fine-tuning the application parts that really count. You can read the proposal questions more carefully and answer it, because you've kind of done some of that prep work. And if that prep work doesn't have to take hundreds of hours, it can really just be I'm going to do 2 hours a week thinking about what I want to do next, or how I'm going to do better, or it really can roll. I think that some of that thinking can really roll into just the work of the organization itself.
I would add 3 things that I think would be helpful, in terms of tips. One that I'd mentioned are the demographics, really being intentional in collecting demographics, identifying the population that you're looking to serve. The other, I would say, research and data, and you don't necessarily need to hire a big firm to do that. There are community health needs assessments for every part of this nation, to be quite honest with you. Every nonprofit health system has to put out community health needs assessments every 3 years. And it looks at data that is directed to like not only public health, but it can be economic vitality, it can be the education system, crime, anything like that. There are also racial equity impact assessments or quality of life plans. So ensuring that you're looking at the landscape, the region in a way that really is intentional, that the work that you're going to be doing is going to be holistic in that way. And then the third, I would say, and it was mentioned earlier in a separate question, but partnerships. Collective impact is, really significant in a lot of ways. If your work is directed towards the community, you likely have to work with different stakeholders and different partners. Identify who those partners are. Identify whether you're working out of your sector, if you're working with faith-based organizations or the business sector, or if you're working with the education system. It would be great to identify and outline who those partners are to demonstrate that you are really looking to build, this collective approach to the change that you're looking to make.
Thank you so much. And I put in the chat one tool that might be useful related to that, which is the Chicago Health Atlas. It's free. It's a free data tool that goes over all sorts of kinds of population data and health issues, and housing issues and food insecurity and education. So if you're working in any of those, any area, check out that tool and see what data they have that's related to the work that you're doing. And that can kind of help to if you want to put any of that in your narratives, or even thinking about, just how you want to expand your work. And then another shout out to our, we had a workshop previously about logic models. So it's another tool that can be used for program planning. And the more you have these things lined out, kind of the easier it is when you're going to write those narratives to tell them to somebody else. So in a grant proposal. So things to keep in mind. So there's a recording on that. We'll share the link here or somewhere else in a follow-up email. But yeah, it's one of the other resources that we have. Okay, so I do want to ask, also Noelle had to hop off, but she shared her contact information and how you can sign up for the newsletter for her organization. So that is in the chat as well. But so whenever a nonprofit applies for a grant, they do, and if you get denied for the grant, you have an opportunity to reach out to the organization to get feedback on why you were denied. So I'm wondering what you guys think, nonprofits, what should they do with that feedback and just the whole process of requesting feedback? If you have any tips on that and responding to feedback.
I would say in terms of the feedback, I wouldn't take it to heart necessarily. And I wouldn't compare, if somebody else got it and you didn't get it. I mean, this applies to almost everything that we apply for, right? There's so many different reasons that we likely will never be able to quite figure out as to why perhaps it didn't work out for us. But so stick with your own feedback. Stick with what you received directly, and try to enhance that. It could have been a lot of different factors. One of the challenges when you have a very competitive grant is that you have that organizations, philanthropy in particular, speaking for what I see is that we get a lot of applications, and sometimes we do think we can fund 50, but it turns out that we can really just fund 40 because the requests for those dollars were a lot higher and the impact is just so much different than what we envisioned. So again, don't take it to heart. I know that not receiving a grant is not the news that anyone wants to receive, but it could be a lot of different factors. What I would say is use that opportunity to continue to build the relationship with that partner, continue to have an open dialogue, attend events, meet other people on the team. Maybe it wasn't a good fit. In our case, we have 5 strategies. Maybe it wasn't a good fit for my portfolio, but perhaps you want a connection with another strategy that is working particularly with small businesses. So there are a lot of opportunities to continue that conversation, and don't just feel like perhaps we don't like you. It is challenging when you get 100 applications and you thought you would just get 25. So just wanted to share that.
In terms of giving feedback, I mean, most of the time when the city, we didn't fund somebody, it was because their application just didn't provide enough detail or provided the wrong kind of details that would allow us to really make a funding decision, or that most of the time, you were competing, the applicants were competing kind of sub-locally, like it was really regional. And so it was like, oh, there were just a lot of people from your area and they had more capacity, they had better, deeper capacity, or they wrote an application that was somehow more articulate. And so those were the reasons. That was kind of the feedback. And so sometimes, like we would talk specifically about how you could strengthen your application questions, what kinds of details we were looking for.
And I think also too, the feedback that you get from one funder or one application sometimes is not transferable to another funder or another application. And so it is important too that this is an opportunity, as Sandy said, to really just build a relationship with that person, right? I see the opportunity for gaining feedback as just another open door opportunity to build relationship, because it may not necessarily turn out to be that you get funded next time, right? And you have to go into that understanding that fact, right? But this is an opportunity to build relationship, an opportunity to share more about the impact of the work that you're having, an opportunity to gain and build that muscle of how to talk about your work, right? Yeah, and unfortunately, the feedback you get may not be helpful for the next grant that you apply to. But once again, it's just that opportunity to build relationship, which I think is so key in this whole nonprofit complex that we work with.
Thank you. So we still have some time for questions. Slowly approaching the end, so I really want to encourage participants to ask some questions in the chat before we reach the end. But I did want to ask a question about collaborating between organizations on a grant. Yeah, I guess how can smaller organizations work together to apply for a grant? Do you see that often? What makes that successful? Yeah, what are your thoughts on co-applying to grants?
In this, at least city of Chicago space, and what I can see from most governments, collaborations are tricky because somebody always has to be the fiscal agent and somebody also has to be the sub. And so a collaboration is never, at least from a financial standpoint, presented as two equal partners, which is of course what both partners would like, in most situations. Two equal partners got together and decided to do this. It's usually one person had slightly more resources or capacity and they had to come in, and then the other person came in under them. We did not see a lot of collaborations in the city of Chicago because financially it usually didn't make sense. In my current job, I do see we are the prime and somebody's the sub, or somebody else is the prime and we're the sub, and that's a good way to, if you're a smaller organization or you have a niche strength that you can sell, that's a great way for a smaller organization to kind of grow into a larger organization. But then, not to sound too sarcastic, but like, good luck finding that larger organization that wants to sub with you, as opposed to just develop that aspect of themselves for themselves. So as much as I think that as funders, we always like to say, oh, it's a collaboration, or we like to have that in as something that we can say we've encouraged. But in my experience, it really doesn't happen that often. And I'm not sure if it's worth the time, except in very kind of boutique situations.
I think I might offer like a counterpart to what Julia just said. When I was at the Department of Housing, where I served as Managing Deputy Commissioner, we rolled out the Racial Equity Impact Assessment on Low-Income Housing Tax Credits, which is the largest source of federal funding for affordable housing. And one of the challenges that we were looking at to build equity was how could our major competitors, usually the big construction industry folks, work with BIPOC organizations and really encourage more smaller businesses to be part of the effort. And so we incentivized partnerships, we incentivized collaborations as a form of mentorship as well for smaller organizations to be able to become one of those giants in the future. A lot of the construction companies are not BIPOC led, are not looking at necessarily the systemic and historic harms in community areas with that granular lens. But in order for us to be able to get those applications, we wanted to make sure that we encouraged those larger companies to reach out to their smaller organizations to collaborate. And so I think here collaboration, really can look like many different things, but it really depends on who is putting out those dollars and how that's being encouraged and incentivized. When we look at community violence intervention, collaboration is very key. It's not just one entity that can address community violence. It's everybody. It's the business sector. It's every member and every entity in that community could help to address community violence. And so there might be, RFPs where we are looking at hubs. Who are the teams coming together? I will say one important thing when it comes to collaborations, and this is to avoid some of those conflicts when it comes to funding and fiscal agent, is you should have memorandums of understanding with all of your subcontractors and all of your partners, so that everybody understands their role from the onset, people understand payments, and so that the entity that is providing the funding doesn't have to come in between disputes between partners. It's not the best use of the relationship with the funding partner. The funding partner really would like to see cohesive partnerships. We would like to see proactive troubleshooting in terms of ensuring that roles and responsibilities and funding have been worked out between organizations. When a funder has to go in to address those issues, it ends up being a different conversation, which probably falls within the line of like, do we continue to fund this or not? Is this going to continue to cause issues and setbacks, or can we figure this out with them and move forward? So collective impact is I think really key, especially if you look at from a health-based perspective, the social determinants of health. You might be doing one part of that whole wheel, so you probably do need additional partners. So I would say do it thoughtfully and make sure that your bases are covered so you don't have to run into any conflicts or setbacks.
Any tips for collaborations, Anna?
I think that we want to see more collaboration, and in order for that to happen, there will need to be some systemic changes. I think to both Sandy and Julia's point, like when it's incentivized, we see it more, but then there are other real barriers to it actually happening many times. But I think clarity at the beginning, the memorandums of understanding, it's really important. I do see subcontracting as a way that many of the smaller nonprofits that we work with, that's their real gateway into being able to access more funding, but then they then reach a limit themselves where they can no longer go beyond being just a subcontractor. They kind of like cap out at only remaining a subcontractor. So I think that it's something that at least at AMPT, we know we like to create spaces for collaboration. It just hasn't transferred into collaborating on a grant proposal as yet, right? And maybe that's the next step for us.
Yes, thank you for the range of responses. It's, yeah, something that sounds great in theory, but then making it happen in practice can be a lot harder. So yeah, hopefully we can continue to give supports to small nonprofits to make those happen, because that is when, you know, the most effective work can get done, really. So don't have any more questions in the chat, but I just want to ask if each of you can maybe give some final thoughts and words of encouragement for small nonprofits as they go through the grant application and capacity building process. Yeah, just any wrap up encouraging words.
I think I can start by saying, so one of the things that we started at AMPT last year really was a suggestion from one of our nonprofit leaders who wanted a Google group, right? And they wanted an opportunity to just kind of have this open forum to be able to talk to other nonprofit leaders in the city. And so we have this Google group now of about 170 nonprofit leaders here in Chicago. And it has been exhilarating, honestly, to see how they use this space. For nonprofit leaders who I know get so many emails to begin with, and for many of them who being a nonprofit leader is their second job, and so I don't even know what the like full extent of their emails look like. There are always resources being shared. There are always grants being shared. And I think it is such a huge pushback to this myth of competition and scarcity that I think we often see in the nonprofit world. We know that being a nonprofit executive can feel so lonely because you feel like maybe nobody else really gets all of the pressure that you're experiencing. And when people come together in this Google group, you see time and time again how much they're able to share, how much they're able to commiserate, how much it means to them to know that somebody else understands what they're going through. And it's just been lovely. And so there are grants that are consistently shared on this space. People, as soon as they hear about some sort of opportunity, share it in the Google group so that everybody knows about it. And I think to me, that just shows just the true beauty of the nonprofit landscape here in Chicago, that everyone really does want to see everybody else succeed. You know what I mean? Like, it sucks like when you apply for a grant and somebody else gets it and you don't, but you also have this feeling of like, man, they're doing good work, so it's good for them, you know? And I love that. I love that. And so I would say definitely to anyone who is still in this, who is still doing this, that it can be a really, really tough road, right? There are so many challenges when you think of systemically how this is all set up, and you're just constantly fighting against all of these things that seem to be going against you. And the people who are committed to doing this work are all good people. And you have to believe that too, right? Even your program offices in foundations, they want the best work to be done as well for their communities, right? And so I think leaning on that and reminding yourself of that this is all human-centered stuff. We're all in this work trying to improve the lives of so many people, and gleaning from that encouragement from everybody else doing the work.
I would just like to say, as somebody who is the board president to a small nonprofit, like I meet with my ED once a week, and a lot of times what I like my job is to point out how far she has come because like because she'll be like, this is happening fast. I'm so tired and this is so hard. And I'm like, but look, you've done I've been sitting here for 3 years and you have done so much in 3 years and it has been hard and growth is hard. Growth is, I think that we don't give like, we all have this idea that somehow growth is going to be easy, but I can attest that like every increased dollar this organization has gotten has been like a pound of flesh. It's really hard work and it's really satisfying and it's meaningful and it's all of those good things. But I don't think that maybe we take into account like that it is hard, it's like if an organization is like a child, it's like, think about how much food little kids eat because they're growing so fast. And organizations are kind of the same way, like they're growing and they have to, it's always something. And like, it's very, just like give yourself a pat on the back because it might feel like nothing, but you probably have done a lot more than you think you did. And it's really amazing. It's that, I think that Anna brings into a real good, brings out a really good point that like, you can kind of assume goodwill. Like there are a lot of people who really are excited by whatever it is you're doing. And that you are in fact making the world like a better place to be in for doing it. And it's really hard work. And one of the things I also do to, tell my ED a lot is like, take a break. Don't burn yourself out. Like, I need you to be in this position for another couple of years until this organization is to a place where you can, she's the founding ED, like this organization is to a place where you can leave it, and so you can't burn out, you can't quit, you can't like make yourself sick or ill, take the vacation, take the day off. Don't be a martyr about your mental health or your physical health or your intellectual capacity, and also understand that it's hard work and that you've probably done a lot more than you feel like you have done.
Yes, to to everything. Don't be afraid to ask for help. I think as you move along the grant making process or grant asking process, that you ensure that you're recording it somewhere. I'm a big proponent of binders, although now it's digital binders, but look at it from like a tabulated position of like, this is like my login information. These are my point of contacts. These are like, screenshots of like what I entered in the past, and keep a record of it and ensure that you're passing that information along to your teammates, and that you're building it out. I think one good challenge would be applying for grants.gov applications through the federal government. They ask for a lot of questions that, maybe the smaller or more local grant partners might not, but they ask for like DUNS information, your IRS standing, like things that you probably didn't think that you needed, but with the questions that they lay out on the federal side, you might just have it on record just in case it ever comes up. And don't be afraid to also ask for letters of support. There are a lot of organizations, particularly elected officials, if you have a good relationship with them, the federal elected officials, the Congress, the congressional delegation, all of them for every state, but your congressperson, your US senators, if you have a good relationship with them, they might be able to provide a letter of support for you, particularly as it relates to federal grants. But if you've done good work and you want to highlight that, maybe you can also ask for a letter of support from a community member, an advocate. Don't necessarily overdo it. Again, try to avoid overcompensating for what you're asking for. Do it if it comes naturally for you. But those would be additional thoughts that I would share. Make sure that the lessons that you've learned, you're passing them on as well, so that others in your team and maybe other organizations can learn from those.